Welcome back, lovely ladies. If you want to become the woman of your dreams, make sure to hit that subscribe button and like this video. And join our Patreon for even more exclusive content. Now, let's dive into today's story.
Theo was 22 years old, an age when he felt he should be brimming with confidence and excitement about life's possibilities. Yet there he stood in the house he had grown up in, struggling with an unease he could not fully put into words. Ever since he was a boy, living under the same roof as his strict father and more easygoing mother, he had been drawn to garments that weren't considered typical for him. As the years passed, the feeling grew stronger. Now, long after his mother had passed, he found solace in her old clothes, especially the beloved cardigan she often wore around the house. He cherished that garment, not simply for how soft and comforting it felt against his skin, but also for the memory of her warmth. No one in the neighborhood knew of his private habit. He hid it as best he could, especially from his father Harold, who had spent years emphasizing what a man should be: stoic, decisive, immune to any behavior that might spark judgment among neighbors. Their street was quiet, lined with well-kept yards, traditional picket fences, and flower beds that each owner pruned dutifully. Theo's father was a retired military man who maintained a crisp lawn without the slightest weed in sight. Inside the house, expectations were equally rigid. Pictures of ancestors hung in tidy rows on the walls, and there was an order to everything that left little room for spontaneity. His mother's passing had come swiftly. She fell ill during a cold winter, and nothing the doctors tried seemed to help. The ache left behind after she was gone was immense. Theo had lost more than just a maternal figure. She had been the person who made him feel seen and understood, even if she never explicitly acknowledged or discussed the inclination he harbored toward wearing garments that blurred the typical lines of attire. Whenever Theo displayed an interest in cooking rather than yard work, or appeared more content reading books about fashion rather than mechanics, she simply said, "You look happy," and let him be. That subtle acceptance had been his lone sanctuary. When she was gone, he felt as though a delicate tether to understanding had been snapped. Months turned into a couple of years without her. Harold retreated further into his strict worldview. Their once lively dinner conversations, where his mother would tease him for his minimal appetite and his father would recall old stories, fell into silence. Theo found himself alone most of the time. He was part of the household, yet his presence was overshadowed by tension and unspoken words. Each morning, he would walk down the stairs and hope that perhaps his father would notice how isolated he felt. But Harold, set in his ways, offered little warmth. They spoke mainly in the briefest of exchanges. "Breakfast is ready in the kitchen," or "Don't forget to rake the leaves today." One breezy afternoon, feeling stifled inside the house, Theo ventured outside to the backyard. The air was mild for that time of year, carrying the scents of grass clippings and distant charcoal grills. He wanted a moment of privacy, so he slipped on his mother's cardigan. Its sleeves reached past his wrists, and the floral pattern on the fabric reminded him of simpler times. He settled on the small wooden bench near the fence, hidden behind tall hedges. In that quiet corner, he was alone with his thoughts and the garment that made him feel unexpectedly calm. His mind drifted to memories of his mother. He thought of the patience in her voice whenever he was upset, her comforting hand upon his shoulder, and the gentle pep talks she used to give him about finding his own way in the world. Though she never used many words about what he wore, or why he might be drawn to her closet on occasion, he sensed that she would never judge him for who he was. That memory lifted some of his loneliness. Suddenly, a soft knock on the wooden part of the fence startled him. He froze, heart pounding. The knock came a second time, a gentle tap. He didn't know what to do. Fear of discovery made his voice catch in his throat. Finally, he mustered the courage to peek around the thick vines. There, standing on a small stool near the fence, was an older woman with gentle eyes and a warm, knowing smile. Mrs. Wu was well into her 70s. She had moved into the neighborhood only a few years before Theo was born, but her presence on the block felt timeless. She was a widow who kept to herself most days, tending a spectacular garden. Her yard bloomed with peonies and marigolds in the summer, and she often came out early in the mornings to sweep her driveway or water her rows of bright flowers. Theo had seen her wave at his father occasionally, but he never heard them speak more than the customary greeting about the weather or the changing seasons. Holding a plate with several round buns, she called softly, "Theo, dear, are you there? I hope I didn't catch you at a bad time." His heart still fluttered. He glanced down at the cardigan and then back at her kind face. She appeared unruffled and patient. Summoning caution, he slowly emerged from the bench area and approached the fence, arms crossed in an effort to hide the delicate floral print. "Hello, Mrs. Wu," he said, wondering how much she had already seen. She extended the plate of freshly baked buns. "I made too many and thought you might like some," she said. Her voice had a gentle, wavering timbre, like someone who had lived many years and still found hope in small gestures. Theo, still feeling apprehensive, forced a polite smile. "Thank you," he said, taking the plate. "These look wonderful. You really didn't have to." Mrs. Wu gave him a soft laugh. "When I bake, I do it wholeheartedly, so there's always extra. Enjoy them whenever you get the chance." Then her eyes seemed to flick briefly to the cardigan before returning calmly to his face. "It's a beautiful afternoon, isn't it? Not too hot, not too cold." He nodded, unsure whether to address what he was wearing. He expected her to ask about it, to raise a question, or to deliver at least a mild reaction. But she showed none of that. Instead, her expression conveyed a serene understanding, as if the cardigan was of no consequence. "Feel free to drop by my place if you ever crave more buns or some tea," she said. "I'd love the company." She climbed down from her stool and disappeared behind the fence, leaving Theo standing there, plate in hand, mind swirling with confusion and relief. He took a moment, pressing his palm against the soft knit of the cardigan's sleeve. He felt vulnerable, but also oddly comforted. Mrs. Wu hadn't flinched. There had been no surprise in her voice, no condemnation. Rather, her tone carried a mild acceptance he hadn't expected. That evening at dinner, Theo sat across from his father, who was reading the newspaper in silence. He tried to muster the courage to mention Mrs. Wu, or even the buns, but swallowed the words. Harold had that particular look in his eye that indicated he was not in the mood for chit-chat. After a few minutes of clinking cutlery, Theo decided there was no reason to force a conversation. They finished the meal in silence. Later, alone in his room, he placed the plate of buns on his small side table and tried one. It was fluffy, warm, and faintly sweet, reminding him of the fresh breads his mother once made on Sunday mornings. The simple kindness of his elderly neighbor comforted him, but it also filled him with questions. Did she truly have no issue with what he had been wearing, or was she just polite enough not to mention it? The following days were much the same in the neighborhood. Theo kept mostly to himself. Harold spent hours puttering in the garage, tinkering with old tools, or running errands in town. Every morning, Theo saw Mrs. Wu outside with her watering can, greeting him with a friendly wave if she caught sight of him through the fence. A few times, she offered him a new plate of baked treats, red bean buns, sweet milk bread, and savory rolls. Each time, she displayed no sign of disapproval. She simply asked how he was doing, talked about the garden, and offered well wishes. Their exchanges were short, but warm. Eventually, Mrs. Wu's invitations for tea began to feel more genuine than a passing courtesy. After the third or fourth suggestion, Theo worked up the nerve to accept. One afternoon, when his father was out at the hardware store, Theo walked around the fence to Mrs. Wu's front door. He paused on her neat, flower-lined path. She had a modest home with a tidy lawn. Vibrant potted plants adorned her small porch. He knocked once, a bit timidly, and heard her call for him to come in. Mrs. Wu's living room was a cozy place, filled with wooden furniture that had been polished over time, soft cushions in floral patterns, and pictures of family members on the walls. A faint scent of jasmine tea lingered in the air. Theo noticed she had prepared 2 cups on the coffee table, along with a small plate of biscuits. "Sit, sit," she encouraged him with a broad smile. "I've been waiting to share my afternoon tea with someone. My cat, Precious, doesn't make for very lively conversation." Theo settled into a chair, noticing a drowsy tabby cat curled up in the corner, tail flicking lazily. "Thank you for inviting me," he said, folding his hands in his lap. He was wearing a plain t-shirt and a pair of jeans this time, but underneath, he felt the same uneasy sense of being on guard. He admired how, in this room, everything felt tranquil. Above all, he appreciated that she had made space for him. Mrs. Wu poured the tea, steam rising in gentle curls. She handed him a cup. "Drink. It's best hot," she said. Then, with careful calm, she offered a soft question. "How is life treating you, Theo?" He studied her for a moment, wondering how open he could be. "Things are okay," he finally replied. "I'm not in school anymore, so I spend time looking for jobs and helping my father with chores." She nodded, her face empathetic. "You don't seem entirely content, if I may say so." It felt as if she could see right through him. He swallowed. "I guess things feel a little tense at home sometimes." He didn't mention the cardigan, but he could sense that unspoken subject hovering. Mrs. Wu, however, was patient, allowing a comfortable silence to fill the space until he felt brave enough to say more. When he didn't continue, she steered the conversation. She told him stories of her youth, how she had moved from one city to another, drifting through various jobs while harboring ambitions that her traditional family frowned upon. She laughed over the memory of sneaking out to watch street performances when her parents expected her to stay home. She recalled how life's twists kept her from pursuing everything she once imagined. Her tone was light, but Theo noticed an undercurrent of wistfulness. "Sometimes," she said, "we do not even realize how much we sacrifice to maintain peace in our surroundings." For a moment, the space between them held an unspoken understanding. They continued chatting about mundane things, recipes, the best fertilizers for her garden, the silly antics of Precious the cat. But Theo felt a shift inside him. Here was a person who was older than him by decades, who likely faced judgments of her own in her day. She was offering a gentle ear without demanding explanations. Before he left, he summoned the courage to address the subject. "About that day in my backyard," he began, face warming. "I was wearing something. It belonged to my mother." Mrs. Wu's gaze was steady, compassionate. "I know," she said. "You don't need to explain. But if you ever want to talk about it, I'm here." Theo felt an unexpected welling of emotion in his chest. He almost said something more, but his voice faltered. Instead, he just nodded, murmuring a soft, "Thank you," as he left. That evening, he retreated to his room and sat for a long while, thinking about the quiet acceptance he had encountered. The next morning, as he helped Harold fix a broken fence post out front, he kept replaying her words. It felt remarkable to realize that someone so outwardly different, a woman from another generation, another background, with an entirely distinct life story, could be the one person who offered him a glimmer of support. Several weeks passed. Theo started picking up odd jobs around the neighborhood to earn a bit of money. mowing lawns, trimming hedges, even helping the local grocer rearrange shelves. He remained discreet about the clothes he wore. Most days, he stuck to conventional attire that wouldn't attract attention. Yet occasionally, on those stolen afternoons when the house was empty, he slipped into his mother's cardigan or one of her old skirts, letting himself bask for a moment in that comforting sensation. He continued visiting Mrs. Wu. She always had a pot of tea ready. Sometimes they discussed books, since Theo had discovered she had a small library of novels in Mandarin and English. She loaned him a few books with swirling, painted covers that depicted tales from far-off places. Other times, they delved into more personal stories about her late husband, who had passed away shortly after they retired, and how she kept her love of gardening as a tribute to him. Her tales gradually helped Theo see that people carried layers of struggle, hope, and hidden desires. She offered him her perspective on how, in the face of disapproval, one might still find bits of happiness. One day, as they sipped tea, Mrs. Wu mentioned something that resonated deeply with Theo. "When I was young," she said, stirring a bit of sugar into her cup, "I wanted to become a dancer. My parents refused to let me take classes. They said a respectable girl should not spend her days prancing on a stage. But I still danced in private. Whenever I had the house to myself, I'd put on my favorite records and move until I felt free. No one else needed to understand or approve. It was enough that it gave me joy." Theo felt a prickling of tears at the corners of his eyes. He connected with her words in a way that felt profound. "Weren't you afraid of being caught?" he asked softly. She smiled. "All the time," she said. "But fear doesn't stop the urge that lives inside us." Then she placed a gentle hand on his arm. "I see a similar spirit in you." The real test came later that season, when the leaves began turning gold and red. An autumn chill settled over the neighborhood, prompting folks to rake piles of leaves on weekends. One Saturday, Harold decided that it was time for him and Theo to attend a church fundraiser happening at a community hall. Theo resisted at first. Large gatherings made him uneasy, but Harold insisted. "It's for a good cause, and you've been cooped up too often," he said. Theo had no intention of causing any stir. He dressed in jeans and a sweater, but under that sweater, he wore a simple tank top that he had modified himself, adding small lace trims around the edges. It wasn't visible, yet he drew secret comfort from wearing something that felt more in tune with what he wanted. It gave him enough confidence to endure the event. The fundraiser was a typical affair in their conservative neighborhood. Potluck dishes, neighbors exchanging pleasantries, lines of tables with crafts and baked goods for sale. He recognized a few men from the local hardware store, a couple of women from the library, and some older folks who used to attend the same events as his father. He saw Mrs. Wu in the corner, setting out a tray of her homemade buns for the bake sale table. She waved at him, offering a reassuring smile. Theo found himself cornered into small talk with a few acquaintances. Most asked about his job prospects, others about his father's health, and a few inquired if he had plans to move out on his own. The barrage of questions, though polite on the surface, made him feel suffocated. He excused himself and slipped toward the side of the hall near the rows of coats and jackets. There, he simply sipped from a small cup of punch and tried to steady his breathing. It was in that moment that a couple of people he vaguely recognized, from the group that often chatted with his father about what a real man does, passed by and paused to look at him. Perhaps it was the slight lace peeking at the neckline, or just the air of difference that Theo carried. Whatever it was, he felt their assessing eyes. One of them, a stern-faced man, looked ready to say something biting, but he must have thought better of it in a public setting. The pair walked on with a shake of the head. Their silent judgment was enough to leave Theo's stomach twisted in knots. Anxiety rose in his throat. He managed to slip out the front door of the hall, stepping into the brisk autumn air. Breathing deeply, he willed himself to remain calm. He tried to remember Mrs. Wu's quiet reassurance. In moments like these, he felt the weight of a world that insisted on conformity. Despite the sting, he recalled how Mrs. Wu had said no one else needed to truly understand, so long as he found a small piece of contentment in what he did. He was about to walk home alone when Mrs. Wu appeared, wearing a shawl around her shoulders. "You seem uneasy," she remarked softly. Theo nodded, glancing around to ensure no one else heard them. "I feel like eyes are always watching, waiting for me to slip up." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "One wrong move, and it's like half the neighborhood is ready to talk behind my back." Mrs. Wu looked at him kindly. "Yes, that's how communities like this can be," she said gently. "But you're not alone in feeling that weight." Then she gestured to a small wooden bench by the hall entrance. "Would you like to sit with me for a moment?" They settled on the bench, leaves swirling at their feet. The sky had turned a gentle gray, suggesting rain might be imminent. Mrs. Wu took a deep breath. "You know, in my younger years, I spent countless nights worried about what people would think if they saw me dancing. It might not seem like much from today's perspective, but in that time, it was considered scandalous." She gave him a measured look. "If people's stares feel suffocating, it might help to have even one other person you can confide in. Have you told your father how you're feeling?" Theo shook his head. "He wouldn't understand," he said, wincing because a part of him still clung to the slim possibility that his father might surprise him. But deep down, he was convinced Harold would see it as a flaw. "He's always cared about what the neighbors might say. He's the kind of man who'd rather keep everything under wraps than deal with gossip." Mrs. Wu patted his shoulder. "When you're ready, you'll know what to do. Until then, you can talk to me." A slight drizzle began tapping on the roof overhanging the bench, and she smiled wryly. "I brought my car. I can give you a ride home if you'd like." Theo glanced back at the door to the hall, imagining his father's disapproving face if he saw him leaving early. But he also knew he couldn't remain there much longer without feeling suffocated. He nodded quietly, and they hurried to Mrs. Wu's small car parked near the entrance. During the drive back, Mrs. Wu asked him if he had ever made anything for himself, clothing-wise. He blushed, admitting that he had tried sewing a skirt using a pattern he found in a library book, but the final product was uneven, and he had hidden it away in a cardboard box under his bed. He confessed he wanted to learn more about tailoring, but hadn't mustered the nerve to enroll in any local class or workshop, fearing he'd stand out. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "there's a community center in the next town over that sometimes offers evening classes. No one there would know you. If it's something you want to explore, maybe consider looking into it." Theo felt a rush of possibilities flood his mind. "Maybe," he replied softly, already anticipating the complexities that would arise with his father. Still, the fact that Mrs. Wu believed in his ability to pursue that interest meant something. They arrived at his house, and he thanked her for the ride. She gave him one of her kindly looks. "Try not to let other people's narrow viewpoints force you into hiding everything. The world can be unkind, but not everyone is out to judge." He went to bed that night pondering her words. Sleep didn't come easily. He caught himself imagining a life where he could wear what he wanted without constant fear of scorn. It was an overwhelming notion. The next morning, he discovered that his father had stayed late at the fundraiser, chatting with neighbors. Harold didn't mention Theo's abrupt departure. Instead, he acted as though everything was normal, asking Theo to help with some yard work. Weeks slipped by. The crisp autumn winds gave way to the chill of early winter. Theo maintained a cautious existence. He wore unremarkable clothes around town, shared brief interactions with his father, and continued clandestine visits to Mrs. Wu's living room. They developed an afternoon routine. She brewed her jasmine tea, and he sometimes brought a small token, like a loaf of bread or fresh fruit. In her home, he felt a quiet sense of belonging. She would speak to him as though he were a treasured friend, never once judging his desires. One blustery afternoon, while raking leaves, Theo had a curious moment. The wind picked up suddenly, sending a gust that whipped through the yard. He saw Mrs. Wu next door, also raking, nearly losing hold of her hat. In a burst of laughter, he dropped his rake to help her chase it. Her laughter was contagious, and by the time they recovered the stray hat, both were breathless from the playful chase. She looked at him, cheeks rosy from the cold and from laughter. "Come inside. You'll catch a chill out here," she scolded mildly, but her eyes sparkled with warmth. He nodded. "Sure, let me put the rake away." He quickly stored his tools, making sure his father wouldn't be alarmed if he glanced outside. Harold was inside napping on the couch, oblivious to the swirling leaves or the neighborly bonding happening next door. Stepping into Mrs. Wu's house felt like stepping into a refuge. She offered him slippers, then bustled around to put the kettle on. The air carried the smell of ginger and scallions from something she must have been cooking earlier. He sat on the couch, letting the warmth seep into his cold hands. Precious the cat hopped onto his lap, purring and kneading happily. When Mrs. Wu re-entered the living room, she looked more serious. "Theo," she began gently, "have you considered where you want to be in the next few years? Not just physically, but in terms of how you live day to day?" He tensed slightly. "I'm not sure. Sometimes it feels like I have to stay under the radar in this neighborhood, or else face my father's disappointment and everyone else's gossip." She nodded. "That might be true here, but perhaps you should consider whether you want to stay in a place where you can't be at ease." She handed him a mug of tea. "I'm not suggesting you run away this instant, but you have to ask yourself what matters most to you." He sipped his tea quietly. Though he'd mulled over the idea of moving out, fear had always held him back. He had only small savings. His father might interpret his departure as an insult or a failure. Yet deep inside, an ember of longing flickered. He wanted to find a corner of the world where no one would blink at what he wore or how he expressed himself. In the midst of his reflection, she stood and beckoned him into a small room off to the side of the hallway. He followed, uncertain of what she intended. She turned on the light. The room was filled with boxes, stacked neatly. "These are some of the things my husband and I collected over the years," she explained, opening one of the boxes to reveal old photos, postcards, and keepsakes. She dug around for a moment before pulling out a small sewing kit. "I used to fix little tears and holes in our clothes," Mrs. Wu said, offering him the kit. "It's not much, but I'd like you to have it. Maybe you can practice the next time you feel inspired." He stared at the kit, a sturdy wooden case with compartments for needles, threads of various colors, small scissors, and patches. Emotions welled up inside him. He felt the sting of tears again, but he blinked them away. "Thank you," he whispered, running a hand over the smooth wood. She smiled gently. "The world might tell us we're too old or too constrained to try new things, but that's not always the truth. My parents once told me I was too old to learn dance, and yet I still tried. Maybe you can sew something just for yourself." She seemed to sense the weight behind her own words. "Don't let other people's rules stop you." He cradled the sewing kit, feeling something shift in his chest. There was a sense of possibility, a spark of courage that he had forgotten existed. That evening, when he went back home, he hid the sewing kit in his bedroom closet. Yet he couldn't resist opening it later, in the hush of night. He unspooled a few threads and carefully re-examined the pattern on his mother's cardigan, which he had tucked away in a drawer. There was a small tear along one of the sleeves. Gingerly, he set about repairing it, threading the needle with trembling fingers. Though it was a small fix, the act felt profound. Each stitch reminded him of his mother and of Mrs. Wu's kindness. He lost track of time until he finally snipped off the last bit of thread and looked at his work. It wasn't perfect, but it looked respectable enough. Most of all, it looked like something he himself had restored. Days later, life pressed on. Harold started complaining more about the weather, about the price of groceries, about politicians he saw on television. Theo felt an undercurrent of tension between them, an unspoken chasm that seemed to grow wider. Sometimes he sensed that Harold was aware of more than he let on, but neither father nor son had the words or the courage to broach the subject. During a bleak winter afternoon, as frosty wind rattled the windows, Harold mentioned that one of the neighbors had remarked that Theo sure is quiet these days. The older man eyed his son across the kitchen table. They say they never see you out much with friends. They're worried you're not working enough or looking for real opportunities. Theo's heart thudded. He recognized it as a masked criticism. I do odd jobs around, he said curtly. I'm saving what I can. Harold nodded once, his expression blank. You're a grown man. People expect to see you acting like one. Theo's jaw tightened. He said nothing more, but the words hovered. Once Harold left the room, Theo let out a shaky breath. He felt that old fear of being scrutinized for any perceived step outside the mold. The conversation lingered in his mind like a cold draft that wouldn't go away. Later, he went to see Mrs. Wu, bracing himself against the chill air. She welcomed him in immediately, noticing his tense posture. She poured him a cup of hot ginger tea this time, the sharp, comforting aroma filling his lungs. You look troubled, she observed. He let out a sigh. My father thinks I'm not doing enough to be the person he wants me to be. His eyes flickered up. I'm so tired of living with that pressure. Mrs. Wu listened intently. You know you don't have to meet everyone's expectations, but I understand how living under the same roof makes it complicated. She tapped her fingertips against the table. Have you considered telling him straight out that you don't plan to live your entire life according to his rules? He swallowed hard. That sounds scary, he admitted. I'm not ready for the confrontation. There was a moment of quiet before Mrs. Wu nodded. Then perhaps take one step at a time. Continue practicing your sewing if it makes you happy. When an opportunity arises, you'll feel more prepared to act. Their conversation meandered through less weighty topics until Theo felt calmer. On his way out, she offered him a container of leftover dumplings. He thanked her, warmed by the simple generosity. That night, he went to bed with slightly less heaviness on his chest. Winter carried on, the neighborhood dusted in snow. The holiday season arrived, bringing sparkly lights and wreaths. Harold spent much of it in mild grouchiness, complaining about the cold and the noise from holiday parties on the block. Theo quietly participated, putting up a small wreath on their door, baking cookies, and feigning some holiday spirit. He even received a modest gift from Harold, a set of screwdrivers. It was a well-meaning, practical gesture, though it fell short of any deeper emotional connection. From Mrs. Wu, he received something far more meaningful. On the day before Christmas, he found a small package left at their fence. Inside was a remnant of satin fabric, folded neatly, and a note. For your next creation, happy holidays, from Mrs. Wu. Theo ran his fingers over the smooth material, imagining what he might craft. This quiet, steady encouragement gave him a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. As the new year approached, the neighborhood resumed its usual routines. The days remained cold, but occasionally the sun would break through to remind everyone that spring lay ahead. Theo kept doing small tasks, saving bits of money, and gradually honing his sewing skills. He managed to create a simple knee-length skirt from an old pattern he adapted. It was plain gray, without adornments, but it fit him in a way that felt surprisingly comfortable. He folded it away in the bottom of his dresser, uncertain when he would dare to wear it beyond his bedroom walls. One afternoon, while delivering groceries to an elderly couple across the street, Theo noticed that Mrs. Wu hadn't been outside lately. Her curtains were drawn. Concern rose in him. He hadn't seen her pottering in the garden or taking her afternoon walks. After finishing the delivery, he hurried to her home and rang the doorbell. He heard her voice from inside, faint and weak. She opened the door a crack, appearing frail. "I'm sorry, dear," she said softly. "I've caught a bad cold, and it's taken the wind out of me." Theo felt an instant surge of worry. "Should I call a doctor or get you anything?" She offered him a reassuring smile, though her eyes looked tired. "I'll be fine. Just need some rest. Maybe you can help me by feeding Precious and bringing in the mail. I don't have much energy to step outside." "Of course," Theo agreed. Over the next few days, he checked on her regularly. He made her tea in her own kitchen, prepared simple soups, and sat quietly in a chair while she dozed on the couch. Though she insisted it was just a cold, he couldn't help worrying about someone who had shown him such kindness. In that quiet time, caring for her, Theo glimpsed what it felt like to be of genuine use, beyond just superficial errands. He found meaning in small acts of compassion. One afternoon, as she napped, he allowed himself to think about his future again. Maybe, someday, he could move to a place where the stares and judgments wouldn't be so suffocating. Maybe he'd find a group of people who appreciated his interest in sewing, or at least let him pursue it without scorn. He didn't know when or how, but he clung to that possibility. After about a week, Mrs. Wu's health improved. She regained her energy enough to shuffle around the house and resume her knitting projects. One day, wrapped in a blanket, she sat at the table while Theo brewed a pot of tea. "Thank you for everything," she told him, her voice now steadier. "It's not often one finds such a genuine friend." He felt a rush of warmth. "I'm just returning a fraction of what you've given me," he said. He paused, then spoke with a note of seriousness. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about not having to follow everyone else's expectations forever." Mrs. Wu set her knitting needles down and gave him a calm, attentive gaze. "Yes?" He inhaled. "I might look for a place in the city, maybe a small apartment. Not right away, but soon. I've saved a little money. I want to see if I can take part-time sewing classes or find a job in a store that sells fabrics or clothes." Her smile was gentle, proud. "That's a bold plan. Are you ready for the conversation with your father?" Theo's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "That's the part that scares me, but I can't live in fear forever." Mrs. Wu nodded. "Being afraid is natural, but so is longing for a more authentic way of living." Her choice of words was careful, but the meaning was clear. She knew exactly the inner battles he was fighting, even without him spelling them out. They left the topic for a while, shifting to lighter chatter about how Precious was starting to get chubby from all the treats. But the idea had been planted in Theo's mind. He began browsing apartment listings in secret, taking occasional trips to the nearby city under the guise of running errands. It was intimidating. Prices were high, and his budget was limited. Yet he kept searching. He refused to give up, spurred on by the sense that he no longer wanted to hide away forever in a place where even wearing the cardigan in his own backyard felt like a risk. Early in spring, an opportunity arose. A friend of a friend, a woman who managed a small fabric shop, mentioned a potential opening for a part-time assistant. The pay wouldn't be much, but it would offer the chance to learn about textiles, patterns, and the art of stitching. Theo felt a flutter of excitement. He arranged to visit the shop one afternoon, using the excuse that he had some errands in the city. The shop was tucked on a quiet street lined with boutique stores. Rolls of colorful fabric were displayed in the windows, beckoning passers-by with bright patterns and textures. Inside, the store manager, a middle-aged woman named Eloise, sat behind a counter, expertly folding samples. She greeted Theo warmly, looking over his minimal resume with a discerning eye. They spoke for a while about the tasks at hand: stocking shelves, assisting customers with fabric selections, keeping the store tidy. Toward the end, she asked, "Why do you want this job?" He took a steady breath. "I'm passionate about sewing," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I haven't had formal training, but I'm eager to learn. I practice on my own projects at home, and I hope working here will help me develop my skills." She seemed thoughtful. "We don't get a lot of young men applying for this kind of position, but I value enthusiasm. If you're serious, I'd be glad to have someone who wants to learn from the ground up." Theo felt a wave of relief wash over him. He left the store with a lightness in his step. If all went well, he could start in a couple of weeks. That left the issue of housing to figure out, but at least he had a direction. The bus ride home was filled with thoughts of new fabric bolts, sewing patterns, and the idea of building a modest yet independent life. Back in the neighborhood that evening, he approached Mrs. Wu's door with a mixture of nervous excitement. She opened it, took one look at his face, and smiled knowingly. "Good news?" she asked, ushering him inside. He told her everything. "Now the biggest challenge is telling my father," he finished, voice trembling a bit. "I'm not sure how he'll react." Mrs. Wu offered him a seat. "Then let's have some tea, and we can think about how you might approach it." Over hot jasmine tea, they discussed potential scenarios. Mrs. Wu advised him to speak from a place of honesty about how he felt stifled, about the job offer, and about the need to create his own path. "Rehearse the words if you must," she suggested, "but stand firm. You're not doing anything wrong." He felt a flicker of dread at the thought of Harold's expression, the stern line of his mouth, the tension in his brow. But he also knew he could not remain silent. That night, he lay awake in bed, heart pounding, replaying possible dialogues. By dawn, he was exhausted yet determined. The next morning, he waited until Harold was drinking his usual black coffee at the kitchen table. Theo set his own mug down, clearing his throat. "Dad," he began, struggling to keep his voice steady, "I've been offered a job in the city. It's part-time at a fabric store." Harold lifted an eyebrow. "A fabric store?" he repeated, as though the words didn't quite make sense. "Doing what?" Theo forced himself to hold Harold's gaze. "Helping customers select fabrics, learning about stitching and sewing," he explained. "I want to take it. I also want to look for a small place to live nearby so I don't have to commute every day." Silence stretched thin between them. Harold's stare hardened. "You want to leave your home to work at some store that sells cloth? Where did you even get that idea?" A rush of emotion tightened Theo's chest. "It's something I care about," he answered, choosing his words carefully. "I want to learn more about making clothes. I can't do it freely here." Harold set the mug down with a clink. "And what about the respect of the people around here? You know how this neighborhood talks. You're going to run off to the city, do something that—" He stopped short, but Theo caught the implication. Something that would raise eyebrows, something that might make neighbors whisper. "You're throwing away your future for a silly hobby." Theo's eyes stung. "It's not a silly hobby," he said, voice shaking. "I've spent my whole life trying to follow the rules you set, but I'm an adult now. I want to work somewhere that doesn't make me feel out of place. I'm not running off. I'm stepping forward." Harold stared, the tension thick. For a moment, it seemed like he might pound his fist on the table or yell. Instead, he exhaled sharply. "If you do this, don't expect me to help when you realize it's a mistake," he muttered, turning his gaze to the window. "You'll be on your own." Tears threatened to surface in Theo's eyes. He swallowed them back, managed to nod. "I understand," he replied. His heart beat rapidly, and his thoughts churned in turmoil. Part of him wanted to storm out, but he held his composure, reminding himself that this was the confrontation he had expected. He moved to the living room, leaving Harold to brood. It took a while before Theo mustered the energy to go out back and sit on the bench. There, amid the mild spring breeze, he wept quietly. Though he had dreaded that moment, he felt a slight release from finally speaking the words. He allowed himself to cry, shoulders shaking, until he felt emptiness where the fear had been. A gentle knock on the fence interrupted him. He looked up, eyes puffy, to see Mrs. Wu gazing over with concern. She didn't say anything, just beckoned for him to come over. He rose, wiped his cheeks, and walked to her yard. They ended up in her kitchen again, the smell of herbs and simmering soup in the air. She handed him a handkerchief and waited for him to gather himself. "It happened," he managed, voice raw. "I told him." She nodded, offering a hug. "You did what you needed to do," she said gently. They sat in silence for a bit, the only sounds the quiet bubble of soup on the stove and the hum of the refrigerator. After a while, Theo spoke, voice trembling. "He basically told me I'm on my own." Mrs. Wu patted his hand. "Sometimes that's what happens. It hurts, but it's not the end." Despite the ache in his chest, Theo felt a curious sense of liberation. For the first time, he had openly defied the narrow path Harold had tried to set for him. He was tired of living with a constant sense of needing permission to exist in ways that felt right to him. Over the next few days, the household was subdued. Harold hardly spoke to Theo, and when he did, it was about mundane tasks, bills, groceries, or chores. Theo accepted that the father-son closeness he might have hoped for would not materialize now or possibly ever. Meanwhile, Theo continued finalizing arrangements at the fabric store. Eloise called to confirm that she was ready for him to start in a week. He also scouted a cramped studio apartment on the outskirts of the city. It was far from luxurious, barely a kitchen, a drafty window, and one squeaky radiator, but it was all he could afford. The landlord seemed indifferent to who he was, only caring that the rent was paid on time. That was enough for Theo. Mrs. Wu offered to help drive him and his few belongings when the day arrived. She rummaged in her garage and found a couple of unused cardboard boxes he could pack his clothes into. When she stopped by his house with the boxes, Harold was in the living room reading, and he hardly acknowledged her. She shot Theo a sympathetic glance, but neither spoke in Harold's presence. Finally, on a crisp morning, Theo gathered his things. Most of it fit into 2 suitcases and a few boxes. One contained the precious sewing kit, some fabric scraps, and his mother's cardigan, carefully folded. Another held the small stash of clothes he had collected over time, ones he seldom dared to wear in public. It felt surreal, stepping out of the house that had been his only home, the place where so many memories were tied, both comforting and painful. As Mrs. Wu loaded the boxes into her trunk, Harold hovered in the doorway, arms crossed. Theo turned for a moment, studying his father's expression. He couldn't tell if Harold was angry, disappointed, or resigned, possibly all three. Theo opened his mouth to say something, anything, but no words came. Finally, Harold uttered a gruff, "Take care of yourself." It was the closest thing to a goodbye they shared. Theo forced a nod, blinking back tears. Then he climbed into Mrs. Wu's car and watched as the old house receded behind them. His heart felt heavy, but also newly unburdened. They made the drive to the city in relative silence. Mrs. Wu reached over once in a while to squeeze his hand, and that small gesture meant the world to him. When they arrived at the studio apartment, they found the landlord, a tired-looking man in his 50s, who handed Theo the key. The space was exactly as Theo remembered, a single room with chipped paint and a narrow window. Yet it was his. Mrs. Wu helped him carry the boxes up the narrow flight of stairs. She set the last one down and looked around, surveying the bare walls and minimal furnishings. "It's not big," she said diplomatically, "but you can make it yours." She patted his shoulder. "Call me if you need anything." Theo enveloped her in a grateful hug. "I don't know how to thank you enough," he whispered. She just smiled. "Seeing you find a place where you can breathe is thanks enough." They parted with promises to stay in touch. Once alone, Theo stood in the middle of the apartment, letting out a breath. He placed the sewing kit on the windowsill, along with the small cutting of a rose from Mrs. Wu's garden that she had placed in a plastic water bottle for him to keep. Next, he neatly hung his mother's cardigan in the closet so it wouldn't get wrinkled in the boxes. Despite the dismal appearance of the walls, a sense of excitement flickered in him. He felt unsteady, unsure of the future, yet relieved to be away from constant judgment. The next morning, he began his part-time job at the fabric store. Eloise introduced him to the layout of the shop: rows of cotton, wool, satin, silk, lace, plus all manner of buttons and zippers. She demonstrated how to measure yardage for customers and ring up sales on the old cash register. Theo found himself enthralled, soaking in information. Though it was a humble start, he was surrounded by the materials he loved. No one mocked him for asking about the difference between organza and chiffon. No one gave him weird looks if he held a floral print up against his body to imagine how it might drape. He was simply allowed to learn. In time, he settled into a new rhythm. The pay was modest, but enough to cover the rent and some groceries. He had a small leftover amount each month, which he set aside to purchase more thread or to experiment with new patterns. On his days off, he explored the city on foot, finding little shops and cafes, observing people from all walks of life, some wearing bold, unconventional clothing, others mixing styles without apology. It stirred something hopeful in him. He stayed in contact with Mrs. Wu, calling her every other week or so. She filled him in on the happenings in their old neighborhood: who was planting new flowers, who had new grandchildren, and occasionally how his father was doing. Harold, by all accounts, remained withdrawn, rarely mentioning Theo's name. Mrs. Wu tried not to dwell on the negativity. Instead, she focused on telling Theo about her own days. She'd taken up a water aerobics class at the local pool. She was trying new recipes, and her cat Precious was still lazing around happily. Their conversations reminded him of how critical her support had been. Without her gentle empathy, he doubted he would have found the courage to leave. Her memories of dancing, the quiet recollections of a life shaped by other people's rules, all of it helped him see that someone else had once faced restrictions and still managed to carve out a corner of freedom. In the months that followed, Theo made steady progress at the store. He learned to advise customers, matching them with fabric suited for their projects. He discovered a love for fashion catalogs, often flipping through them on his lunch breaks to glean new ideas. He stitched himself a few modest outfits in his free time. Nothing too flashy, just comfortable pieces that blurred the lines of conventional dressing. Walking through the city in these garments felt both thrilling and nerve-wracking. Occasionally, passers-by glanced at him with curiosity, but many didn't pay him any mind at all. Over time, the shame he had carried began to diminish, replaced by a sense of quiet boldness. One windy day in early summer, Theo took a train back to the old neighborhood. He wanted to visit Mrs. Wu in person and check on how she was faring. Stepping off the train, he felt a sense of nostalgia swirl with a hint of trepidation. As he walked the familiar streets, he noted that not much had changed. Lawns were still meticulously trimmed, fences freshly painted. The same hush lay over the block, as though time moved slowly there. When Mrs. Wu opened her door, Her eyes lit up at the sight of him. She ushered him in, remarking on how healthy and confident he seemed. He set down a small bag of treats he had brought from a bakery in the city. They settled into her cozy living room, and it was as though no time had passed. She asked about his job, about the fabrics, about his experiments with sewing. He showed her pictures on his phone of a simple blazer he had managed to stitch. She leaned in, admiring every detail. "Your mother would be so proud," she said softly, reaching out to pat his hand. Theo felt emotion swell in his chest. For a moment, memories of his mother's cardigan fluttered through his mind. "Thank you," he whispered. "I hope she would be. I like to think she'd be happy I'm finally doing something that brings me peace." They shared tea, the warmth of their bond as present as ever. Eventually, Theo found the courage to ask about his father. Mrs. Wu sighed, glancing at the curtains as if expecting Harold's disapproving gaze through the window. "He's fine physically," she replied, "but he doesn't talk much about you. I think he feels your absence more than he lets on. Perhaps one day he'll come around in his own way." Theo let out a long breath. He didn't know if or when that day would come, but he appreciated her honesty and her gentle optimism. Later, as dusk fell, she walked him out to the fence where their yards met. They stood side by side, gazing at the quiet street. A sprinkling of evening sunlight gilded the rooftops, reminding him of all the afternoons he spent hidden away wearing that cardigan. Mrs. Wu gave him a sideways smile. "This fence," she said, tapping it lightly, "once divided two very different lives. But sharing tea and our stories, we found a connection that spanned generations. I'm grateful for that." Theo looked at her, love and respect brimming in his gaze. "Me too," he said. "You changed my life more than you'll ever know." He gently squeezed her hand. They parted with a soft promise. He would return for a visit again soon, and she would keep sending him letters with any neighborhood gossip worth sharing. As he headed back toward the train station, he felt the evening breeze brush across his face. He smiled to himself, remembering how, not so long ago, he had felt nothing but fear when wearing garments that spoke to him. Now, thanks to one unexpected ally, a kindly older neighbor who offered him buns and heartfelt support, he had found a measure of freedom in living life on his own terms. He understood that there might still be challenges ahead, but he also knew he wasn't entirely alone. In the lingering twilight, the echo of Mrs. Wu's gentle wisdom seemed to guide his steps. Even across cultural divides, age differences, and all the unspoken judgments of the world around them, they had discovered a link. A bond of defiance against the idea that life must be lived according to someone else's script. And for that, Theo felt gratitude that glowed like the last rays of sun, painting the horizon with promise.
Did you like the story? Hit that like button and tell me what you thought in the comments. Do you want to hear more stories? Subscribe and hit the bell. For exclusive content and early access, check out our Patreon. You can find the link in the description, or you can watch any of the videos shown on my right. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.